Hold on, it's setting up my meeting for Facebook. It's doing a little bit of a slow load this morning. There he goes. Okay. So a couple of people joined while I was wandering over to Facebook. Good morning, Shantae, Veronica. So great to see you both. And Charlie. I think I've welcomed the folks so far, I think, that have joined. We're Facebook living right now, and if you don't want to show your face, I just wanted to let you know that that is happening. So feel free to hide yourself if you don't like to show your face in the morning. So I'm Dana Sargent. I'm the director at Cape Fear Riverwatch, and with these things, we just do a couple announcements prior to our speaker. With COVID, obviously things have changed, so we don't have as many announcements as I would like, but the Greenfield Lake Boathouse is open. So if you are wanting to get outside and hanging out with some alligators and some nature in our beautiful city, I encourage you to get out to Greenfield Lake. It's open every day except for Tuesday. We've got a wonderful staff member out there, a new staff member, David, who is managing the boathouse, and he is doing an exceptional job. Good morning, Esther, and good morning, Sue-Ann. And so please try to get out there and enjoy that park. It is just an amazing, it's an amazing space. We're also doing eco tours. Kaylin, our education program manager, is doing eco tours around Eagles Island, and I took one this past Monday with her, and it is phenomenal. She does the history and she does the ecology. These are very small groups, totaling up to 6. My group was just me and 2 other folks. So it's really intimate, and you learn a lot about the history of Eagles Island and the ecology, and it's just beautiful. And I encourage you, if you'd like to, if you enjoy paddling, it's a pretty easy paddle. It's about a 2-hour trip. It was amazing. So you can email Kaylin for that, and you can find her email address on our website. If you go to capefearriverwatch.org, or if you feel like jotting it down right now, it's just Kaylin, Kaylynn @cfrw.us. We've got a lot of things going on in the advocacy world right now. I'm not going to get into all that because Sherri's going to talk to us about environmental advocacy, but I would encourage you to please check out our website. We are making a lot of updates to that website. We're adding a lot of our advocacy actions. We're adding our grant work. We've got a great grant that we're working on at Greenfield Lake to clean up that water with partners at UNCW and NC State, as well as an engineering firm and the city of Wilmington. So we've got a ton of things going on. We're actually, I kind of think, a little bit more busy during COVID than we were prior to COVID. But we're definitely just completely grateful for the involvement and the engagement of our members throughout this tough time. And it's so great to see you all here. And with that, I'm going to let Audrey take over. Audrey Dunn, who, if you haven't met her, is our outreach officer at Cape Fear Riverwatch. She just started in July, was working with us as an AmeriCorps team member, and we snagged her up, and we are insanely grateful because she's amazing. So Audrey, please take it away.
Thank you, Dana. So this morning we have Sherri White-Williamson from NC Conservation Network here to talk to us about environmental justice issues in North Carolina. So we're really excited to have you here today, Sherri. Thank you so much for being here. So as the Environmental Justice Policy Director at the NC Conservation Network, Sherri leads the organization's efforts to connect impacted community-led teams and organizations with decision makers. Prior to joining the NC Conservation Network, Sherri worked at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency in the Office of Environmental Justice, where she managed the Federal Interagency Working Group on Environmental Justice and the National Environmental Justice Advisory Council. Sherri also currently serves as a board member of the Rural Empowerment Association for Community Help, and she recently co-founded an environmental organization that will focus on environmental justice, working to build sustainable communities. I don't know how she has any spare time, but in her spare time, she enjoys baking, DIY projects, and playing with her dogs. So thank you so much, Sherri, and take it away.
Thank you so much, Dana and Audrey, for inviting me this morning. It's really exciting to be able to talk with folks from just down the road from me. So I'm really excited about being able to do this. Dana, are the slides up? Or Audrey?
You're on mute, Dana.
I thought you were going to run them from you, but I can definitely open it over.
Did you set me up as the host, co-host?
I set it up so that you could share your screen.
Okay, okay, great. Okay.
Perfect. And I'm going to go ahead and mute folks who are not muted yet. Good morning, Ashley.
Okay. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay. I wanted to start the conversation with the name of someone that you're familiar with and a definition that you may not have seen, because this is not the US EPA definition. And we'll talk about that a little bit later and how we got to that definition from this one. But back in 1987, Dr. Ben Chavis, who is from Wilmington, coined a definition for environmental racism. And as you can see, that definition was the deliberate targeting of ethnic and minority communities for exposure to toxic and hazardous waste sites and facilities, coupled with the systematic exclusion of minorities in environmental policy making, enforcement, and remediation. If you just think about that definition from 1987 and what's happening now, you can see that nothing has really changed from the time that he coined that definition in 1987. I wanted to start from the beginning because North Carolina was ground zero for the national environmental justice movement. There were actually some activities prior to 1982, particularly in Texas. In Houston, Texas, Dr. Robert Bullard, who is very prominent in the movement, conducted a study of some communities to look at where hazardous waste sites were being placed. His wife at the time had taken on litigation against some of the pollution that was going on in Texas. And he was first to identify that there were these dumps and they were predominantly placed in minority communities. However, it did not reach the level of a national movement. It was not until 1982 in Warren County that we finally got a national movement on environmental justice. And for those of you who are familiar with the Warren County events, I'm going to spend a little bit of time, maybe for those of you who are not quite as familiar. The protests started as a result of some PCB dumping that had occurred along the highways in North Carolina that was discovered by the state. And then the problem became where that contaminated soil was going to be placed, because at that point in time, the state did not have a toxic waste dump site. The protest started in Warren County, and the landfill was proposed to be placed in a little place called Afton, North Carolina. What the state proposed to bury there was 60,000 tons of PCBs, or that would be approximately 6,000 truckloads, if you can imagine that much waste going into one small place. The process of deciding on Afton began with the state identifying sites across the North Carolina area, across the counties, and they came up with 90 sites that they decided to hone in on to decide exactly where that waste was going to go. They chose Warren County. Warren County was probably the worst place it could have possibly gone, but it is within the pattern of what we saw prior to the waste being placed there. Warren County was 64% Black. The township that they were proposing to put the waste in had a population that was about 75% Black. And the county itself ranked 97th in per capita income. At that point in time, there was about $7,000 annual income to households in that particular county. While there was temporary success during that protest, it fueled the national movement. The residents literally laid down in the road in front of trucks to keep them from coming in, not just adults, there were both adults and children. The protest went on for about 6 weeks. Many people don't realize that the protest lasted for that long. Most people think of the Warren County protest as something that lasted a few days, but this actually went on for about 6 weeks. There were over 500 people that were arrested, and it was the first in history where the sighting was the reason for all of the arrests in this particular incident. And here are a couple of pictures. You may recognize that handsome young man at the front of that picture. That is actually Dr. Chavis sort of leading the protest at that point in time. And here are some pictures of some of the young people that were arrested. The state troopers actually showed up in full gear with buses to be able to cart away the people. I don't think even they anticipated how many people and how long this protest was going to be going on. And right now I want to share with you some of the voices from that protest. And this is about a 4-minute video. So let's see if we can get it to work.
My name's Bill Kearney. I grew up in Warren County. Matter of fact, this is my family church.
My name is Dolly Burwell, and I was born in Warren and Vance County.
I'm Wayne Mosley. I was born and raised not too far from this very site.
When I came along in Warren County, it was still a farm community.
I grew up in segregated schools.
We're a rural community that was by some considered poor.
It was not a pleasant experience, but I had the love and support of a big family, an extended family, and a wonderful community.
During 1978, Buck Ward owned a transformer company in Raleigh. As part of the insulation, there was an oil that contained PCBs, or polychlorinated biphenyls. That carcinogen was very difficult to dispose of, very expensive.
PCBs had been dumped along the roadsides of the state of North Carolina by Ward's transformer illegally.
Because the state of North Carolina did not have a toxic dump site, one had to be established.
It was evident to me that the state was going to put the PCB dump in Warren County.
They said, well, let's take the path of least resistance.
Because it was basically politically impotent, and because it was a poor county. Those made for conditions where the state thought that it wouldn't be any problem putting a landfill.
Something needed to be done. Here at Cody Springs Baptist Church, the church opened its doors up to us. This church is located approximately 2.5 miles from the actual site.
I remember there were meetings here, there were organization meetings, there were marches that started from the church, and the church played a significant role in being a hub.
What does God require of us but to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with our God? So they saw that as part of what God required them to do, to stand up against injustice.
Just the audacity of someone who comes and just dumps in your community And the Bible says, do unto others as they have you do unto you.
The only thing we could do was to raise our voices and to stand up against what we knew was an injustice. We were really not trying to start a movement. It turned into a movement.
I think I was inspired that day. For some reason, I was working in Raleigh and had only asked off for a day, thinking I was to come up, participate.
Children was a part of it. My own 8-year-old daughter, who I thought was going to school, and she said, well, I'm going to go with you to protest. And as a mother, you know, I knew that the trucks would be carrying toxic waste and wasn't sure that I would be safe, and certainly I didn't want to put her in any danger, but I couldn't say to her, this is worth putting my life on the line for, and this is something you can't stand up for too. It was about justice.
During that march, time was frozen and we were caught up in the emotion of what we were doing. I remember leaving, I remember the joy of camaraderie, and I remember before you, we were here.
And it was the first time in my history that I saw whites, black, and Native Americans in this county really come together and stand up.
We were met by approximately 50 highway patrol, full riot gear. There were helmets, face shields, batons in hand. And we said, oh my goodness, what have we gotten ourselves into now?
She was saying to the reporter that she was not afraid of going to jail, but she was afraid of what this toxic waste was going to do to her community.
I and 66 other people voluntarily laid down in the road to block the first trucks.
People who had never marched before, they found other ways to participate, whether that was cooking, whether that was delivering food and water to the marchers.
In the recreation yard, which our supporters had gathered along there after we were arrested to give us moral support. As the day went on, we began to get hungry. Nobody had fed us. So apparently some of the ladies had gone home and fried some chicken and made some biscuits. And what they did is they got some of the young boys that were athletes to act as the deliverers of this food. We would say, throw me a wing, or throw me a thigh, and they would throw it, and we would catch it in the yard.
During that time, we registered people to vote, and people became engaged politically, and as a result, they elected a representative government in Martin County. We were able to garner the resources to make the governor live up to his promise to detoxify and clean up that landfill.
Being a Christian and realize that Jesus not only dealt with the spiritual, but he also dealt with the natural. And we have a responsibility to be the voice. So I believe now it's really important that we who are inside the county began to tell our story.
We felt that we had to do those things in order to ignite the spark that lit the fire that went across the nation and became an international movement. It was the convergence of civil rights and environmental rights.
I think Warren County serves as a really beacon. Poor people and a few people can have a huge impact, and ordinary people can make an extraordinary difference.
I think
Just for just in case you didn't see the chat, we weren't able to watch that one. So for the next one, if you have another one that you could pop it in front of the point, I think that will work.
you couldn't see the last one.
No, but we could hear it, and I'm gonna go ahead and pop the link into the chat, and so people can watch it after.
Okay.
I don't want to interrupt it. We could hear the voices, and so I think that was good.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. One of the people who showed up for the protest march was a guy named Walter Fauntleroy, who was the representative from the District of Columbia. And when he went back to Washington, he got a resolution passed to have the Government Accounting Office conduct a review of hazardous sites across the southwestern part of the United States to see what they found. And as a result of that report, there were three major findings. One was that 3 out of 4 hazardous waste facilities in the southeastern part of the country were located predominantly in African-American communities, that the African-American communities across the country represented only about 1/5 of the residents in the region, and that looking at all of the factors that were determinant in where those facilities were placed was that race was the most significant variable, regardless of all of the other factors that were taken into consideration. So remember these findings, because you will see these come up several times in a number of the reports that we'll be talking about today. In 1987, the United Church of Christ, led by Dr. Ben Chavis, commissioned a report to take a look again at waste and race in the United States as a result of the 1982 report. That report was authored by one of my mentors, Charles Lee, along with another individual, Vernice Miller Travis, and looked at all of the factors again across the United States. And again, the same factors were determinant. Race was the most significant factor. And even if you factored in income, race was still more determinant. So if you had a minority community and a white community that were at the same level of income, 99% of the time that waste dump was still going to go in that African-American community because of race. Income was the least factor that was taken into consideration when those decisions were made. In 1991, as a result of all of the activity that began in Warren, there was the first National People's Color Conference in Washington, D.C. That conference brought together hundreds of people from across the country and across the world. In fact, you may know a couple of the names of a couple of the planners of that meeting. Donna Chavis, who is of the Lumbee tribe in Robeson County, was one of the co-chairs of that gathering, as well as Mac Ledgerton, who is Donna's husband. Those folks came together to start talking about the similarities that they all were facing around the issues of environmental justice. And as they talked, they found that they had more things in common than they differed. And so this began a broader movement. Out of that meeting, there were 17 principles that were established. And those principles are still taught today in schools and environmental justice programs and in books. If you read them, you will find that most authors will refer back to these original principles that are still very relevant today as we move forward in the environmental justice movement. In 1992, after a lot of recognition to the issue of environmental justice, the Environmental Equity Working Group, which is now the National Environmental Justice Advisory Council, recommended that EPA establish an office that looked specifically at the issues of environmental justice. That office was originally named the Office of Environmental Quality, which is now the Office of Environmental Justice, but the transition from the name of environmental quality or environmental equity to the Office of Environmental Justice was a process, and it came about as a result of community hearings and listening sessions and hearing what the people thought and felt. And it was a very interesting process as well. Now, remember I told you at the beginning, the definition of environmental racism that I posted was the original definition that Dr. Chavis coined back early on in the movement. The current definition that EPA uses for environmental justice is a compromise, because many of the original participants in the movement wanted to keep the definition for environmental justice and make it environmental racism. But as a result of many conversations and much compromise, the definition that EPA has now is the definition that is most universally recognized. It's used by all of the federal agencies. It's also used in state agencies. If you look at the Department of Environmental Quality and other documents coming out of the state of North Carolina, this is the definition that is used most often. And I want to focus on two phrases out of that definition: fair treatment and meaningful involvement, which continues to be bones of contention among many of the people in the environmental justice world because of interpretation. But what I'm going to share with you now is the interpretation and meaning from EPA of what both fair treatment and meaningful involvement are. According to EPA, fair treatment will be achieved when basically everyone receives the same kind of treatment, and that decisions that are made are based on equity. Oftentimes we still know within the environmental justice movement, there is not yet fair treatment. When decisions are made, they still are often made, most often made based on race and income, and the same kinds of bad treatment or maltreatment or decisions that are most harmful to already impacted communities are the decisions that we still need to work very hard on to make sure that there is fair treatment across the board. Basically, if you look at environmental justice, fair treatment would actually mean that everyone, not just poor or people of color, but everyone are sharing the same benefits and burdens of decisions around environmental placement of toxic waste sites or other facilities that have an impact on many of the communities in which some of us live. Meaningful involvement is another thing that we still struggle with many times. In a traditional context, meaningful involvement would mean as organizations are making decisions or as someone or an agency is making decisions about allowing a permit to be issued for a facility to go someplace, that there would be early and often discussions with those communities about its impact. But that is not happening still as it should be. So until we reach a point that there is meaningful involvement of communities that are most affected, we still don't have the kind of environmental justice that we would hope to be able to have. Another study that was done in 1992, the National Law Journal conducted a study and published a report entitled The Racial Divide in Environmental Law. And it took a look at EPA Superfund sites to see what was happening with Superfund sites and how the cleanups were being handled. And what they basically found is that if those sites were in non-minority communities, upper income communities, that those sites tended to be cleaned more quickly, and that any penalties that were assessed were very stringent. Whereas the reverse happened in communities of color or low income communities. The sites were less likely to be cleaned, or if they were cleaned, it took much longer, and there was not high penalties to pay for those industries when they were penalized for the types of facilities or type of dumping that they were doing in those communities. So as you can see, there's a trend here. Every report that came out tended to support the previous report in terms of what was happening in low income and communities of color versus other communities in the United States when it came to decisions about dumping of waste. Finally, in 1994, after some fits and starts in Congress to try and pass environmental justice legislation, President Bill Clinton issued Executive Order 12898, which basically directed every federal agency to consider environmental justice in all of its policies and practices. He put together, or it created a working group of all federal agencies to start this process, as well as to order these agencies to issue an annual report on what they were doing as it related to environmental justice. There were a number of goals out of Executive Order 80, and I just listed 3 of them here. But basically, the intent was to direct and make sure that the agencies paid attention to the environment and the conditions that were being created in communities of color. They worked to create non-discrimination in federal policies. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as I talk a little bit more about the work that I did with the Interagency Working Group. And then they wanted to work to provide federal agencies to provide more information to the communities that were most adversely impacted from environmental exposures. In 1994, the Interagency Working Group on Environmental Justice held its first meeting. It was headed by the administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency, and it was co-chaired by the chair of the Council on Environmental Quality. It brought together all of the agencies that existed at that time at the federal level and created a number of different task forces to look at how they could implement Executive Order 12898. So one of the ways that they decided to do that was to fund some demonstration projects across the country to try and show best practices and how those best practices could be implemented or modeled in other places across the country. In 1999, they selected 15 demonstration projects, and then in 2003, they funded an additional demonstration projects. The most successful demonstration project exists in Spartanburg, South Carolina, and I hope that I'll be able to share that clip with you at the end. We'll see what happens with that, but it is called Regenesis. It started with a $20,000 seed grant and has brought in multiple partnerships and millions of dollars. And when the BMW plant settled in Spartanburg, South Carolina, one of the reasons it gave for the decision to settle there were many of the partnerships that had been formed with the Regenesis project in Spartanburg. And I'm gonna try to give this one a shot. Dana, let me know if you can see it when I get it started.
Okay, if not, I can throw the link up on my end and we'll try it that way.
Okay, I have it up. Can you see the visual?
Not yet. I think minimize your PowerPoint. Still not yet. I'm going to go ahead and copy this URL.
Okay.
And then I will pop it up over here and we'll see if that works.
Great.
Unfortunately, I can't copy and paste, so I got to type things, which is just weird. Hold on. Okay. All right, so I'm going to nab the screen back.
Okay.
All right, can everybody see this YouTube thing? Can somebody unmute and let me know if you can see this?
Not yet, Dana.
Nope.
Veronica.
Okay, hold one sec.
Well, the links are in the PowerPoint. What we can do is just send the PowerPoint or the links out later so that folks can view it at your leisure, and I can sort of tell you what's happening.
I think we can get it going. Just give me 1 second here.
Okay.
Let me just make sure that this is the right share that I've got this on. What are you guys looking at right now?
Dana, I don't think you've taken back the screen yet. I think we're still, there we go. We're still sharing Sherri's screen.
Okay, hold on 1 second.
Now you have your screen up and it's just got river.
Now we have no screen. We're not sharing anybody.
Okay, hold on 1 second. I'm getting there.
Yeah.
So
Yay. Okay. Does this look like the right video, Sherri, with this sort of opening here?
There's no picture, but hit the, let's see what happens when you, oh, unavailable.
Okay, hold on. Let me pull your link back because you know what? I've got it on the PowerPoint in your email. Hold on 1 second. Sorry, folks. Thank you for your patience. Always a joy working virtually. We'll figure it out. We will figure it out. Everybody can see all my emails. That's okay.
the one where you owe me $1,000 in there.
That's hilarious.
Thank you for making me feel better about my inbox.
Sorry, that's the first YouTube. I hate when they put zeros and O's in.
Right there, that's it.
You don't know which is which. All right, hold on a second. Okay, that's not right. YouTube. Dash, no cookie.
Ooh.
BD.
Technology is such a wonderful thing.
Equals, if this is a 0 or an O, I think I'm going with
That's a 0.
It's a 0.
Oh, it's the same thing I went with last time. Looks like it's not enjoying that. Let me just make sure this is right.
Dana, can you cut and paste that link into a separate window?
I don't think it's, oh, here it goes. Oh, it was, thank you, Veronica. I thought it was an image and it wasn't linking. Yay. Okay.
That's it.
Fantastic. Let's just do this. I'm gonna make this bigger. All right, ready to go. Thanks, everybody.
Environmental justice is
Something happened with the volume.
Check your mute button, Dana.
what was happening in the
Sorry.
environmental justice is a real effort, not just by the federal government, but across society to address the problems of the disadvantaged, those people who don't have voice or vote or money.
Industries were dumping whatever into the environment, into the water, and we just didn't have any teeth to really fight with.
What was happening in the late 80s and the early 90s was just an incredible upsurge of grassroots activism on environmental issues.
When we had the first National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit in 1990, there were people there from the Marshall Islands. There were people there from Puerto Rico. There were people there from India, all over the world.
They started talking to each other and networking and sharing stories. I think that's where the real tipping point, or where it really started taking hold at the national level.
And we gave birth to a conversation that people would recognize as their own, right? So we gave it a language, we gave it words, we gave it a science base, we gave it a public policy base, and we gave it a base that was rooted in the power and mobilization of people on the ground. So it couldn't be denied.
You may notice in the literature that it abruptly changes from equity to justice. Well, that was done by community groups.
And we were invited to a meeting at the United Church of Christ in Albuquerque.
I remember an old lady standing up and she said, "What is equity? What does that mean? Does that mean that we want equity and poisoning people?" And we were like, "Well, no. What we want is justice. We don't want to." I know. She ripped the doggone handle off.
When they were using the language, environmental justice and environmental racism, we would look at each other and smile and nod our heads, because then from that day on, we knew that we were part of not only a national movement, but a part of an international movement.
That social movement was happening worldwide, but it was also happening at a very intense level here in the United States, everywhere you look, everywhere, every corner.
What it said to environmental activists around this nation is that your voices were heard. We get it, we understand it, and our science proved that there are issues in the areas in which you guys speak of.
It was logical that the federal government, EPA, and the Clinton administration would take this up as an issue.
Executive Order 12898 was signed by the president in 1994. And it's the rock upon which we now continue to stand in terms of the jump off point for doing more good work.
And it sent a clear message to industries that would dump into our rivers, into our air, that those days of the old were gone. And they had to find ways to reduce their emissions and give back to those communities that you had harmed. This is where we're at now. And it's a better world because of Executive Order 12898.
Okay, I'm gonna pop the share back to you. I may have muted you, Sherri, so keep an eye there.
Okay, can everyone see my screen again now?
We can see you.
Okay, let me start the share then. Okay. Can everyone hear me now? Okay. In 1999, the Congressional Black Caucus, while it had been doing some work, actually got in on the environmental justice issue in a large way. The Congressional Black Caucus is the group of Congress people in Congress who represent districts across the country. And in 1999, at their annual legislative session, they established an environmental justice brain trust. And the person who chaired that brain trust is a name you may recognize, Representative Jim Clyburn or James Clyburn from South Carolina. Representative Clyburn started a process of issuing an annual environmental justice report during those conferences. They no longer do it, but at that point in time, it was important to continue having that report issued to bring attention to the issue. Part of the reason why this report is no longer issued on an annual basis is that the federal agencies are supposed to do that. I did a little checking before today, and some of the agencies have reports that run up through 2017, but most of them don't have anything past that time now. Hopefully, they will be able to go back to issuing those reports because they tended to be very informative in terms of the steps that each agency had taken to address ongoing concerns around environmental justice that were within their purview. In 2002, there was another People of Color Summit, and that one, they expected about 500 people, and they ended up with over 1,400 participants that showed up. And it expanded on the discussions that they had had earlier around environmental justice and began to look at it more globally, because there was a recognition at that point that a lot of what was happening in the United States was happening in other countries, and a lot of the waste that was created in the United States was being exported to other countries, creating some of the globalization and international issues that we hear talked about all the time now. And one of the things that started happening with the environmental justice movement was that many of the states began to try to address environmental justice in their own ways. Some of this legislation that I show here is still in place. Others are not in place. Some are still referred to, but you can't find them if you go to look for them. So I want to focus particularly on the 2001 Department of Environment and Natural Resources Public Policy on Environmental Quality. It was issued in 2001. You cannot find it on DEQ's website now, but it is still referred to in many of the documents that environmental justice activists use when they are trying to advocate on behalf of communities that they are representing. The second big thing that happened in North Carolina was that in 2018, the DEQ appointed an Environmental Justice and Equity Advisory Board that one of your own, Veronica Carter, sits on now. In 2020, this year, there were two major occurrences. Virginia, back in June, I believe it was, codified its Environmental Justice Commission and made environmental justice state policy such that the governor directed all state agencies to consider environmental justice in their policy making and their decisions. And just a little over a week ago, the state of New Jersey passed legislation to make environmental justice policy in the state of New Jersey. This was legislation that had been negotiated over a 10-year period of time. And while it's not perfect, it still allows environmental justice advocates to have something that they can put their teeth in when they are trying to argue for equity and decisions around permitting and placement of toxic facilities in communities that are already extremely overburdened with other toxic facilities. And here is the North Carolina Public Policy on Environmental Equity that was issued and became effective October 19th, 2000. It's very short, but it's pretty powerful if more people, I think, were aware of it and started to refer back to that document. Maybe even it would make DEQ now to put it up someplace more prominently so that people could see this document online. And I want to talk a little bit now about some of the challenges moving forward in North Carolina. And I just decided to settle on 4. There are so many more that we could talk about, but climate change is probably the one most foremost in people's minds. The permitting process in North Carolina is another huge issue. And that is an issue because the concept of cumulative impacts has not become a part of the permitting process in the state. And I'll talk a little bit more about all of this in following slides. The Clean Energy Plan is something that came out of the governor's Executive Order 80 and is in the process of being developed now. Recommendations to the governor are to be prepared by the end of this year. And that clean energy plan proposes to take North Carolina to zero carbon emissions by the year 2050. And then finally, one of the most important facets to local communities are the meaningful engagement of these communities as these various processes are moving forward through the pipeline, that we as advocates, that legislators, that elected officials, not wait until the 11th hour as they're trying to put together a report to realize that, oh, we haven't talked to that community. We need to at least hear what they have to say. And then that discussion not having any real impact on a report that comes out. That meaningful engagement needs to be at every point during any process as we move forward. The issue around climate change, obviously, is that we are seeing more frequent and severe storms, particularly in the southeastern part of the state, particularly in areas where we all live. And those more frequent and severe storms are causing additional problems, especially for the communities most impacted. Rural communities that are located around many of the concentrated animal feeding operations, whether they be hog farms or poultry farms, or whether they be in low areas that are floodplains, which is a large part of where many of us live. Thinking about how we address those concerns and how we prepare for what will happen or will continue to happen as we have these more frequent storms, and how to think in it early how to get folks taken care of when they come and hit us. Recovery and resiliency planning for impacted communities. The state is going through a huge process now of looking at recovery and resiliency planning. But one of the things that is most relevant in that process, again, is to make sure that the state is really considering the most vulnerable communities, because even the best recovery and resiliency plan, if it doesn't consider folks who are living in homes that are rental properties, for example, because a lot of these plans are headed toward or benefit homeowners. So if a person is living in a rental property and that property is damaged, any monies that are going to repair that property is going to the owner, not the renter. And so in many situations, we find renters that are in situations where they are vulnerable and unable to recoup from what has happened. And then we have to also consider, as the climate changes and we have these severe incidents, that those same communities that are getting the heaviest impact are the same communities that have the highest levels of death and disease, and adding these other incidents on top of that just makes that problem worse and exacerbates everything else that they have to deal with on a daily basis. Permitting process, as I said, has not exactly been successful at this point. When I say cumulative impacts, I'm referring to consideration of not just a facility that's asking for a permit in a particular area, but looking at all of the facilities in that area and all of the pollution from all of those facilities, and how that added pollution would impact that community that much more. And unfortunately, at this point, most permitting processes do not take into consideration cumulative impacts. And at some point, we have to get to a point where we are considering cumulative impacts for some of the same reasons that I've already mentioned. And if we can get to a point that we are considering cumulative impacts, then we may reach a point where we can see significant policy change that can reduce the exposure in the communities that are most impacted by all of the decisions generally. When I talk about cumulative impacts, again, these are just a few of the things that I'm talking about. Air quality, particularly PM 2.5, which is the tiny particles that can get into lungs and create respiratory problems. And you know that Most of these communities already have high levels of asthma, high levels of other types of respiratory diseases. And if the air is further compromised, then that only exacerbates those conditions. Water quality, obviously, for many reasons is an issue because many of the impacted communities, particularly in the rural part of the state, have groundwater. They don't have city water or water that is hooked up to some central location. And if the water is contaminated because of seepage from polluting facilities, then those communities aren't getting safe water and are prone to suffer as a result of that. And many of you have heard a lot about the CAFO situation and how the CAFOs impact every part of an individual's life who lives near them. And then finally, oftentimes we don't talk enough about children's health. Children tend to be the most vulnerable, and we need to do more to adjust or adapt so that children's health will not be as adversely impacted as it is now. As I mentioned, the Clean Energy Plan is another upcoming issue established under Executive Order 80. And as I said, it proposes to move North Carolina to a carbon neutral state by the year 2050. There are actually 2 public hearings that are planned in the coming weeks. On September 9th, there is a public hearing from 1 to 3 p.m. That is being sponsored by the Duke Nicholas Institute and the folks who are on that committee putting together the report and the recommendations for the governor for the end of December. The second meeting is on September the 16th from 6 to 8 p.m. It is a public hearing. You have to register, but it will also be recorded for folks who are not able to attend either one of those meetings. But both of these meetings are specifically targeted to community engagement. So I would encourage all of you, if you have networks that should be a part of that discussion, please have them to do so. I'll send that information to Dana. It's actually so that you can share it with communities that you may know who would need to be a part of this. And as I said, it's particularly targeted to communities and community groups. And then meaningful engagement. And I don't think I can say too much more about meaningful engagement because I've talked about it throughout. But again, it just simply means that whatever we're doing, that we are going to local communities and community leaders early and often. If you don't have those relationships, it's important to start building those because no plan is complete unless the communities that are most vulnerable and would be most impacted by the decisions coming out of those programs or policies are a part of the conversation to make sure that we understand how it would impact them and what we can do in those policies to reduce the impact. And then there have been many discussions for why we need policy change. And I wanted to point out some of the reasons here, just succinctly for why we need policy change. In North Carolina, many of the decisions that have been made have created dangerous and unhealthy communities. So policy change would hopefully help to reduce some of that. The communities of color and low-income communities suffer disproportionately, and I think we've all seen that more readily with COVID-19 and how COVID-19 has disproportionately affected those communities. If we have significant policy change, then we can protect the most vulnerable citizens in the state. And by doing all of the above, we can reduce the vulnerability in the communities that are most impacted. So policy change is important. I recognize that it's slow, but it's something that we have to work on consistently in order to assure that the people that we want to make sure are healthy remain that way or become that way. And again, changing policies help to improve lives, and it may even help to improve the lives of some of those outside of the communities that would not think about ways or would not think that changing policies for folks living in low-income communities and communities of color would have an impact on them, but it certainly can. And finally, I mentioned the Regenesis project, which is the project in Spartanburg, South Carolina. As I said, they originally got a $20,000 small grant from EPA back in 1999. And that has now turned into, and I'm sure it's more than this amount now because this is from 2015, $250 million in public and private funding and more than 124 partners as a part of this project. It's a very impressive project, and I would suggest that to anyone, if you had an opportunity or went through Spartanburg, to check this project out. Harold Mitchell, who started Regenesis, is a phenomenal person. He is a former state legislator, but now is busy doing other things and traveling, not just in the United States, but internationally, to share his experience and the model that they use with people all over the world. And Dana, I am going to let you try and share that if you can.
I got ahead of us on this one. I pulled it up while you were talking.
Great.
Saw it was coming, so give me 1 second here.
Okay, I'm going to stop my share.
Okay. Everybody see this? Can you see it, Sherri? I think you're.
Yeah, I can see the screen. It's coming. I'm sure it's coming up in a minute. It's probably loading.
Okay. Is it showing the little colored boxes yet?
Yeah, it's showing the colored boxes.
Okay. I think we're good then. Let me hit play here.
In the late 1990s, the residents of the Arkwright and Forest Park neighborhoods of Spartanburg, South Carolina, were living among 6 brownfield sites, 2 hazardous waste sites, and a chemical manufacturing plant. Harold Mitchell Jr. formed an organization called Regenesis to represent neighborhood interests in cleaning up contaminated and abandoned property and revitalizing the community.
If we could rebuild this community, not just sit and complain and look at the problems we've endured for decades, but let's try to see if we can turn this ship around. We began to look at the various initiatives that the community members had envisioned, from healthcare to housing, job training.
Since its inception, Regenesis has evolved into a thriving public-private partnership, including residents, local industry, and government agencies at the local, state, and federal level.
Remarkable achievement in the last 13, 14 years here in Spartanburg. The driving force has been Harold Mitchell.
Not only Harold's vision, Harold's temperament, but Harold's ability to enlist people that frankly may not have gotten along in the past. Building those bridges.
Starting with an initial grant of $20,000 from EPA's Office of Environmental Justice, Regenesis has generated $270 million worth of community investment. The community now has improved housing, upgraded infrastructure, improved employment opportunities, and an established federally qualified health system. A new market tax credit supported the development of a new $6.1 million green recreation center and a long-awaited grocery store plaza. With Regenesis as a model, the South Carolina State Legislature is considering recommendations for cleaning up and revitalizing communities throughout the state. The American Planning Association is proud to present the 2015 National Planning Excellence Award for Advancing Diversity and Social Change in honor of Paul Davidoff, to State Representative Harold Mitchell Jr. and the Regenesis Project.
Share.
Thanks, Dana.
Sure. Get this back to giving you rights. There you go.
Okay. And as a last thought, I just want to leave you with a quote from John F. Kennedy from 1963. Simple justice requires that public funds to which all taxpayers of all races, colors, and national origins contribute not be spent in any fashion which encourages, entrenches, subsidizes, or results in racial, color, or national origin discrimination. And with that, I'm closing, and I'd be more than happy to answer any questions that you might have. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Sherri. Can you end your PowerPoint so we could do Q&A with everybody? There we go. Okay. So we are back onto the Zoom screen. If you can, and you feel comfortable showing yourself, I think it's always better to see the beautiful faces of everyone. Just makes you feel a little more connected during these disconnected days. Thank you so much, Sherri. That was so informative. I know that there is at least one question from Facebook. So maybe we'll start there. Deborah, would you mind reading that question you got from your watch party?
Sure. The question, which was from Natalie Hinton Stallings, is there a curriculum provided to school systems across the state to inform students? They will become the advocates for change in this state. But I'm gonna add on to that question, where would it go? Would it be in history? Would it be in science? But it's part of North Carolina. As you said, we were the forefront of this, so it should be, I don't know, just waiting on your answer.
I'm not aware of a curriculum in the state. I think it would be fantastic if that were to happen. I imagine it would be part of history, but it could also be part of a civic engagement course, I suppose. I think there are several places that could probably fit. But I am not aware of any curriculum in the state at this point.
Thank you.
So feel free to unmute yourself. You have the ability to do that, everybody here, and ask away if anybody has any questions.
Yeah, Brayton Willis here. I have 3 comments. One, you talked about Executive Order 80 about carbon reductions, greenhouse gas emissions. I just participated in the WMPO's, the Wilmington Metropolitan Planning Organization's update of the 2045 transportation plan. And while EO 80 is out there, there is no mention in that 2045 plan about greenhouse gas reduction. As a matter of fact, there's nothing in there that goes through and measures the alternatives to see which ones create less carbon footprint. And so I think there may be a disconnect somewhere in there between EO 80 and how we develop our transportation plans here in North Carolina, at least down here in the Wilmington area. That's one point I'd like to make. The other 2 points I'd like to make, down here in the bottom end of the Cape Fear River, we've been receiving gifts from ChemHours, the Gen X pollution. And that has caused and is going to cause some extreme water rate increases, especially upon those people of lower income or stressed income in our area. I mean, we're literally spending hundreds of millions of dollars to develop high-tech water treatment facilities, yet the state doesn't seem to want to pay attention to us down here. There seems to be some disconnect on those of us that live downstream receiving these pollutants. And I would suggest that in the definition of sustainability, those people upstream that use our resources like the water from the Cape Fear River, our drinking water, should at least have the common decency of returning that water after they make their profit as clean or cleaner than it was given to them in the first place. This is a tough issue. And then thirdly, we've got some projects that are going on here, the deepening of the Cape Fear River from the Port of Wilmington out to the ocean. That's another critical issue where we're going to see the cumulative impacts that you mentioned, especially in the issue of flooding, sea rise, combined with maybe a hurricane or two pushing that water back up into the river. So there are three issues out there that we here in this area, I think, are going to see some dramatic impacts as we go down the road here. Those are my
Thank
three.
you for that comment. Chemours is one of the issues that our organization has been very, very involved with and will continue to be involved with. It's another part of our office, and I'm not on top of everything in our office at this point, but you can be assured that we are paying attention to all of the issues that are related to the environment.
And Brayton, I can share, since you're new to Cape Fear River Watch, at least at this event, we did sue the DEQ and Chemours a couple years ago, and the result of that was the consent order. This is a really intense piece of law that requires the facility to do a lot more than they would have otherwise had this not been, had we not sued. And there's a lot of great information on our website. If you go to capefearriverwatch.org, you'll find a tab for advocacy, and you'll see Gen X in there. Kemp Burdett, our river keeper, along with me and the Southern Environmental Law Center, and all of their amazing experts and partners are keeping a steady eye on Chemours to make sure that they're following the extremely stringent requirements that we were able to get passed under this consent order. I can tell you that Chemours is not happy about this consent order, and we've been fighting them tooth and nail every step of the way with our lawyers. And so we're definitely doing a lot of work to that end, along with all of our great partners like North Carolina Conservation Network and the other amazing environmental organizations in this community, and with, of course, the support from folks like Veronica working on the EJ board, and making these conversations, like you mentioned, Brayton, just sort of top of mind for our DEQ and the secretary. I do have a question from the chat that was requested that I pass along. Does Sherri know the voting records on this issue for the current candidates for the General Assembly, for which we will be voting in November?
We have been compiling information on voting records. Someone else in our office handles the legislative issues. And I can check if you would send me an email, whoever is asking the question, I would be more than happy to check in with our office to see if they would have information on who it is you may be interested in. I've just recently taken on some lobbying responsibilities, so I'm not quite up on what's going on the legislative side.
Okay, and I can share to everybody on the group that the League of Conservation Voters has a great, I forget what they call it. Deborah, is it the green voter card or green? I can't remember what they call it, but they.
Yeah. We list candidates who are supportive of environmental issues, and she called my name because I'm a board member on the C3 side. And just came on board with Senator Harper Peterson, who is one of the candidates the League of Conservation Voters has put on their list of people to support. Did you get off? I know I saw you come on my screen. So that takes the onus off. If you go to our page, it'll list the candidates, NCLCV, that are being supported because of environmental issues. Thank you, Dana.
I have a question for Sherri. Hi, thank you so much for this presentation. I'm so glad I didn't miss it. I've been a part of Cape Fear River Watch for a little bit. I think this is my 7th year. And there's just been so much that we've learned about just the unfortunate consequences of our decisions here in the US. We're huge consumers. And 4 years ago, I started the Cape Fear River Watch book club. So we've read several books about how we really just do horrible things, how everyone is impacted by pollution. But when you consider the fact that we have a massive environmental pollution issue in the United States as huge consumers. When you consider that there's still a lack of corporate awareness, and there's a lack of integrity in some cases. When you mentioned the permits, I'm so glad that you brought that up, because living in California, or being from California, where contractors would build where there is history of earthquakes happening or some of these really tremendous natural disasters, and a contractor will build these beautiful homes for people with money to live in, that people that are not of color or low income, but people that have incredible wealth, they'll build these housing communities, knowing that in about 10 years there's going to be an earthquake, but they say, oh, what the heck, that's 10 years from now, we'll pay the fine and be done with it. So I've seen injustice happen on both sides of the spectrum, and neither of it's fair. But I feel like there's a corporate awareness issue that I think Cape for Riverwatch and groups that Veronica Carter's part of are trying to educate people in high positions, like exactly what you're doing to people. And I feel like that there's a huge corporate waste disposal issue. Like, it's not okay just to dump toxins anywhere where it's going to leak into the river, et cetera. So educating corporations that are ignorant about how they dispose of their waste. And then I feel like there's a community awareness opportunity. Like, some people in these communities are just trying to get through the day. Like, some of these people in low income communities, their daily round consists of making ends meet or taking time to watch their kids play, and they just may not be aware of the hazards that surround them, and they're just trying to get through life. So I feel like there's a community awareness I don't want to call it an issue, I instead want to call it an opportunity. Like, we have an opportunity to go in as people that are advocates for the environment and teach more people, this is actually in your backyard. And unfortunately, some of these communities, specifically, Black and brown communities, low income communities, even if we educate them about their hazardous surroundings to their health, et cetera, we still have a huge, massive environmental pollution issue. So I feel like we have to address both of them at the same time, having more integrity about how we dispose of it, reducing our use of products that contribute to this pollution issue. But my question for you, after putting this amazing presentation together and having been involved, what is your outlook, on progress for low income and communities of color with respect to environmental awareness, or getting out of those communities, or doing a regenesis? I mean, what is your outlook?
You raise an interesting question. I'm not very optimistic, and I would, if you have not read it, I would suggest that you read the book entitled Toxic Communities by Dorcetta Taylor.
Ooh, okay, that's for book club material. I have to get this down. It's called
Toxic Communities, and it's by Dorcetta Taylor, Dorcetta is the last name. And she looked at some of the issues that you're raising now. And one of the first questions people tend to ask is, well, they know the problem, why don't they just move? And it's not an option of being able to move for many folks in these communities. These are communities that they moved into decades ago, following job opportunities. And if they were to move, they would not be able to afford to move anyplace else. The property values where they live have gone down significantly because of where they live. So there's so many issues, not just an issue of educating. I would wager from my work that most of the folks who live in these communities are very aware of the toxic pollution that they live in and under every day. I'm talking to a community not too far from me who live near, we have a regional trash dump here in my county. The trash comes from as far away as Durham. And the community there is, part of the community is predominantly African American. They don't have any options. They have been struggling just to get clean water from the county for 15 years now. I spoke with one of the members in that community 2 weeks ago, and they were telling me they have 3 filters. They have a filter on their water pump, they have a filter on the line, and they have a filter in the house. They went to get water, ice cubes out of the refrigerator a couple of weeks ago, and the ice cubes were brown because of the contamination in the water. But they don't have an option to move. They've been living there, they're retired. So while I wish I could say I'm optimistic, unless policies change and unless something is done to clean up some of the dumping. And one of the things that need to happen is lawyers need to take a different tack, especially the ones representing these industries, is to try and convince their clients to be good corporate citizens. I'm not sure that that will happen, but
Right.
there's so many challenges that we face. My first internship was in California, in Oakland and the Central Valley. So I know exactly what you're talking about out there with, with corporate folks stealing water from local communities, to be able to water the almond trees and, the grapevines and that kind of thing. So these communities are constantly struggling. And it's almost as if they're fighting against the tide because they just don't have the power politically or the resources financially to do the kind of work that they need to get done. And many of them who are doing the work are doing it in their spare time or free because they can't get support to do anything else.
Sherri, do you think that it would be possible to make it harder for contractors to build in low-income communities until there's some type of inspection on the type of waste disposal that neighbors that is within a certain range before they build these communities? Because those who are living in low-income communities are living there because that's what they can afford. But there should be, at this point, now that we have more knowledge about these chemicals, these pollutants, there should be a stricter policy in place for people to build housing developments in these places. And do you think that if that's a stretch, could we have some type of a signage that says, warning, there's this plant or there's this PC, whatever chemical, could we at some way warn people that are going to possibly live there that they're at risk for exposure, or that it's had a long history of dumping or something, so that people have more of a choice that are ignorant to these types of things that are working with very few means, compared to those of us on this meeting?
I think a lot of what you're talking about has to do with policy, and it's
Right.
either policy at the state, federal, state, or local level, and it's going to have to be an issue regarding permitting and zoning, and many of the things that are decided 10 or 15 years before people decide to locate in certain areas. And even though some people may be aware of or not aware of the pollution or toxins in a certain area, as you said, many people are moving in those areas because that's where they can afford to live. And it's important for them to have a roof over their heads. And unfortunately, we've got to do a better job of not just educating them, but of educating the people who represent them or help them be able to elect officials that will represent them in a way that makes where they live safer for them to live.
To that point, Sherri, I would love to just interject with a couple things. First of all, let's welcome Senator Harper Peterson, who just joined us. Speaking of elected officials who work for the people. And I do want to ask, if possible, Ashley Daniels, I don't know if you feel like you might want to add to that question regarding the mapping tool with respect to DEQ's mapping tool and your thoughts on that. I'm just putting her on the spot here, but I know she knows a lot about this.
I would just go back to Sherri's earlier point, and hi Sherri, it's good to see you. Thank you for being here. Yeah, the earlier point about cumulative impact. I think it is helpful for folks to know what's in their backyard. There is a possibility that people might make different decisions if they know what chemicals they're impacted by, if they know what industries have been in their neighborhood. But at the end of the day, without some kind of cumulative impact scale, it's not helpful for us to keep saying like, we don't want this here, this community doesn't want this here. And people deserve to know to the extent that they've been impacted, to the extent that several industries are impacting them, to what scale. And I feel like our elected officials, I feel like our governing bodies should feel some kind of responsibility for knowing how their constituents are impacted. So that's the thing that I would put for the mapping tool. I did have a question for Sherri. Regarding the some of the conversations around like CAFOs and methane, there's been like kind of two sides of, well, there've been multiple sides of conversation about whether methane is a suitable use for some of the lagoons that are in more rural parts of the state. And for folks who just want the lagoon shut down, have been really pushing back, saying that actually it's not worth the trouble that it would take to produce methane. That would be more harmful. And so I'm just curious to know what groups like REACH and EJ Network and maybe some others that you work with, what their perspective is on the issue.
Most of those organizations see it as being more harmful than helpful. Because first of all, it's bringing more unwanted infrastructure into communities that are already heavily impacted. The second thing is many of the studies that look at methane and biodigesters have found that there's just as much leakage from the process as methane that would be captured from the process. So it basically zeroes out. So the argument that this is a good thing is not necessarily an argument that works well. The other issue is that as you extract methane, you're increasing higher levels of nitrogen and other toxic chemicals. So those same communities are having problems dealing with different toxins that are in the air that are just as or more harmful than some of the toxins that are already there. The problem that I have having a degree in energy regulation and law is that North Carolina is the only state in the United States that has decided to make methane a part of its renewable energy portfolio. That should tell everybody something. Methane from CAFOs is not necessarily a renewable energy source, but it's certainly from the industry side of the coin being touted as another stream of income for these owners of these large poultry and hog facilities in the state. So again, those most vulnerable communities are not being considered in the way that they should be considered as these decisions are moving forward. But we have to recognize once again that these communities don't have the power that the pork industry and the Farm Bureau has as it relates to legislators, not just at the state level, but at the federal level as well. So that continues to be a problem that we will continue to have to work on a daily basis.
Thank you, Sherri. I do want to jump in here, Veronica Carter. I know you mentioned her during your presentation, and I just wanted to remind everybody, Veronica Carter is a member of the Secretary of Environmental Quality's Environmental Justice Board. She got a couple comments, so I wanted to give her the floor for a few seconds here.
Hi, I've been putting stuff into the chat as people were talking. On the DEQ mapping tool, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, I put the link to it. It will show you where permits have been already issued You just in your communities. But the real thing I want to bring up is that permitting is, and I said a local issue, and people may disagree with me here, but every permit I've successfully fought against, we found it at the local issue. You know, all politics are local is an old political science adage. And I say that because there's going to be a permit's going to come to either your city, your town, or your county, depending on where that particular item is being cited at. And full disclosure, I'm on the Leland Town Council as well. So when a permit comes in front of those elected officials, it's up to you and us, the people, to get excited about it and tell your elected officials, I don't want that, or that's not a good fit. Or, oh, by the way, did you know that there are already 7 existing brownfields within a 2-mile radius? Or there's a school, a Title I school within a 1-mile radius. Those are things that make elected officials very nervous, trust me. And I think Senator, I was gonna say Senator Harper, because I know him, but Senator Peterson would agree with me. Elected officials get real excited when a couple of hundred folks start showing up at meetings and saying, this is not exactly what we want in our area. And oh, by the way, here are the scientific reasons why, or here are even the moral reasons why. And so that mapping tool, while it still has some kinks that need to be worked out, is a good step forward. And if you weren't familiar with it, you want to play with it, if you have suggestions for it, please feel free to go to that website that I pointed out there and talk to the folks at DEQ. And if they don't give you a good answer, then let somebody on the EJ and Equity Board know, including myself, and we'll be happy to bring it a little bit more resoundingly to their attention. Thanks, Dana.
Thank you, Veronica. Senator Peterson, I don't know if you wanted to chime in on CAFOs. I know you've got a piece of legislation sitting around over there on poultry. And I would like to comment just on behalf of Cape Fear River Watch in terms of that issue. Obviously, Kemp has been leading that fight to get the industry to clean up their waste management processes along with EJ communities for about a decade, maybe more now. And this methane issue to us seems a little bit of a greenwashing attempt. And in terms of the nitrogen, our scientists on our board have shared with us, that this is, you're going to, like Sherri said, you're going to be increasing, that they're still going to be spraying. You're going to be increasing the load, which will be detrimental to our water. Sorry, so Senator Peterson, anything from you?
Thanks, Dana. And just disclosure, even though I'm a legislator, I work behind the scenes for Cape Fear River Watch. Thanks, Dana. Thanks, Sherri. Thanks, Deborah Dix, Maxwell. I think the consent order, DEQ's consent order, is a good model going forward. We made some headway, Dana, thanks to Cape Fear River Watch, Southern Environmental Law Center, DEQ, and the courts. And you've covered some, I've been listening and I finally got on, but we need to not only know what's in the water or the air, whether it's PFAS or these nitrogen and phosphates coming from these CAFOs, we need to know the health impacts. We need to biomonitor the populations that have been affected. We haven't been able to do that because we haven't had a legislature that is interested in that. And that's why I ran, not to be political. And that's why when we switched the majority in the House and Senate in 2020, we can begin to address these inequities in a very big way. And we can put the gauntlet down. I compare DEQ to a sheriff with $5 in his pocket, quarter tank of gas, and no bullets in his gun. We do a lot with a little, and we can change that because we know that the Republican legislature has defunded and understaffed DEQ, DHHS, and DOJ, and we can change that. So there's hope on the way, real hope and real policy action and legislation that will address every issue we're talking about. And we see other states ahead of us on this, and we can mirror what they're doing, pay attention to what they're doing, and see the success. But so many issues here, but the health side of this is crucial. And we need to know what impacts, and there's good studies, and we know that from East Carolina, Jane Hoppin and others, on the impacts of PFAS and Gen X and PFO and things like that. Again, I'm just here along with other good legislators, Deb Butler and Pricey Harrison up in the Piedmont area, because we know it's not just the Cape Fear region, Lower Cape Fear, it's statewide, nationally, internationally, but we need policy and legislators that'll follow through. So that's really all I want to say. I take my hats off to everyone. I recognize quite a few people here. Thanks for all the work you do. We're seeing results. I hope you feel optimistic going forward, because we've got, Clean Cape Fear. Dana, you and Emily Donovan were, co-founders of that, a great organization to expose the inequities and the facts. And I'll just add, just for anecdotal information, I introduced a bill, a poultry study bill. We know the swine industry is having an incredible impact on health, but the poultry industry 5 times the size, and the discharge of phosphates and nitrogen is unregulated. No inspection process, no application process, no testing, flies under the radar, and it is a disaster waiting to happen. Sherri, you might have some information on this as well, but we need to take a look at that industry. And when I asked that question and when I introduced this bill in 2019, they looked at me and laughed at me and said, "Go away." And to quote a legislator, and I'm not shy about sharing this with you, okay? He said, "Take this back to those pimps and whores downriver and tell them, mind your own business," okay? I'll quote, and that's the attitude they have, because they have the political power to manage the legislation that pushes us back. So anyway, there's help on the way. Happy to be serving the community, and there are other great leaders throughout the state that are now paying attention, and we're going to see a sea change in the next year. So thank you.
Sherri, did you want to have anything to add to that?
No, just that the poultry issue is a huge issue among EJ communities, because most of those poultry facilities are being placed in those communities. And if you saw the most recent Riverkeeper report looking at poultry, the counties that could least afford placement and have some of the highest levels of disease are the 3 counties that are the highest placements for those industries. And it's close to you. It's my county, it's Duplin County, and it's Robeson County. And if you think of those counties and the populations there, that's all that needs to be said. And it's deplorable that those industries don't have to get not one permit in order to place. As long as they've got the land to put it on, they can build it. The only time they need to get a permit is for the electrician or the plumber or somebody else. But in terms of the environmental implications, none whatsoever.
Sure, if I could just add to that quickly, we've looked at states like Georgia, Alabama, Arkansas, which are large poultry states, and they have regulations in place, good regulation, fair regulation, and they prosper. It's just we don't want to be bothered with that, and we've got to change that attitude through legislation.
Mm-hmm. We're running up on 11. I wanted to give a little bit of time because we've been talking about this issue of engagement, and Sherri mentioned numerous times in her wonderful presentation about how the community impact is key. Some of the comments have already touched on education and policy. Policy doesn't happen without education. Education comes first, action comes second, policy comes third. And so I wanted to give the floor just for a couple seconds just to Audrey Dunn on Cape Fear River Watch and Deborah Dix Maxwell, who we are partnering with the NAACP on a grant that we won from the Women's Impact Network. Thankful to that community organization for entrusting us in this grant. And I wanted to just give Audrey a little time to summarize that project and let y'all know what's going on with that project.
Thank you, Dana. So I guess I just want to say thank you so much to all of our community leaders who are here, and thank you just to everyone who's here this morning to learn about this and to have these discussions, because environmental justice is something that we are finding over and over and over again is so central to the issues that we're working on at Cape Fear River Watch. It's just inextricably linked. And we are committed to centering environmental justice in our work as an organization. And to that end, we have started a new program called our Environmental Justice Civic Engagement Program. And we're doing that in partnership with the New Hanover County NAACP. So we've been working pretty closely with Deborah, and we're excited about what's to come. Hopefully this fall, things are a little bit changed because of COVID, but the plan is to start the program by listening to New Hanover County's communities of color and low wealth communities, so that we can find out what their priorities are, and just really listen and hear and have genuine discussions, so that we can better know how to support our communities of color and low wealth communities. And then the second phase of the program is, after that, we want to start building training programs and training sessions. And with community leaders who have been identified, then we will create materials, and we'll talk to students, and maybe we'll do some of these. Someone put in the chat box, there are programs from Project WED and Project Learning Tree, and using those in order to empower our youth to make change with our decision makers, and to learn how to be meaningfully civically engaged, such as this little youth right here that we're seeing on screen. And after that, we hope to, we hope to rally the community and actually go to decision makers and have those discussions with decision makers, so they can know what the priorities and needs of our vulnerable communities are. And hopefully at the very end of the program, actually going to Raleigh and lobbying there. So Deborah, do you have anything you want to add?
Not much, just thankful for the collaboration and for those who came on today, for Sherri and the presentation this morning, because there's a need for my people to understand environmental justice and to act on environmental justice. Just the other weekend, we took a sea level rising certification, because that truly impacts this area, not just people of color. And we'll be getting more of that back to you. Thank you, Dana, for sitting through that weekend with the class with me. It's very important. And if I ask people if they just unmute themselves, name some EJ issues in this area that we need to discuss. I heard Sherri mention the CAFOs, Chemours. You forgot the other one we were involved in?
Oh yeah, Navassa with Kermagee, we've got Stop Titan, we've got methyl bromide, we've got wood pellets.
There are a number of issues in this area. We got a municipality who purposely didn't go through the steps with the brownfield, because each step makes a different notification, so they stopped, so they didn't have to go any further. So we got a lot of issues, so I need your help, and I'll be talking with everyone everywhere about this. We wanted to do more, but COVID changes things. That's all I can say. So here we are on the screen. But if we all mask up, we can get together sooner. Thank y'all.
Thank you, Ms. Deborah and Audrey. Sherri, this was a really great. I don't think people want to end this conversation, but I don't want to take up too much more of your time or everybody else's time. Do you have any final thoughts?
Well, thank everyone. Thank you for joining in this morning. I hope this was helpful, and I am available. Part of my responsibility at the Conservation Network is to build bridges to impacted communities. So if I can be of any assistance, please reach out to me. My email is Sherri, SHERRI, @ncconservation.org. I am actually bringing on someone else to help support me soon, so I won't be quite as pulled apart as I am now with all of the things we're working on, but I would be more than happy to work with any of you. As I said, I live here in Sampson County, so I'm just up the road from you as well. So feel free to reach out to me at any time.
Thank you so much. And I wanted to let everybody know all the resources in the chat. I will compile and save on a doc that I will be putting on our website. We now have all of our, thankfully, COVID has given us an opportunity to save all of our First Saturday seminars on the website since March, because we've been running these virtually since then. So on our website, capeforriverwatch.org, on our calendar, you'll find First Saturday seminars, and under there, you'll see a link to all of the presentations. Once this one, the recording stops and everything is saved, I'll add it to there, and I'll include a Word doc with all of the resources, because there have been a lot of resources shared from this great group of people that have gathered. Many of you keep an eye out for Audrey to be asking you to contribute and support our environmental justice civic engagement program. There's so many great leaders on this chat. And with that, does anybody else have anything they'd like to ask or state before we head off and enjoy our Saturday? Enjoy it more, I should say. Miss Deborah, yes, ma'am.
I'm sure all of you have done this on here, but please encourage everyone you know who hasn't to complete the census. It's down to the wire. The absentee ballots have started being mailed out. Keyword, started. So if we don't get it in, you have that option. And you have a phone number to call your local Board of Elections in New Hanover County. If you have a question, come to our meeting on the 4th Thursday and you'll hear from the director of the Board of Elections at 7.
Oh, thank you. That's good to know. And we'll definitely be adding that to our announcements as well at Riverwatch. And just before I go, I need to mention one thing. Cape for Riverwatch is a 501c3 organization. Senator Peterson is here. We support legislation that is helpful to our mission. We don't endorse candidates. Just need to throw that out there just in case anybody was misunderstood. And thank you everybody so much. It's so great to see you all, and have a great long weekend. I hope you enjoy yourselves and get out in nature. Bye.
Thank you,
Sherri.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.